Now let's look at an example where there are no real solutions. That means there are no x-intercepts, the graph doesn't cross the x-axis, and when you have no real solutions, you'll find this out because b squared minus 4ac, your discriminant, is going to be a negative number, so it's going to be less than 0. Okay? Now, you won't know this until you start to use the quadratic formula. So with the quadratic formula, again, we want to make sure we have standard form. Since we have standard form here, we can go ahead and find a, b, and c. A is 1, b is 2, c is 3. Now, I'm going to zoom in here and actually make my pen a little bit smaller because this is going to take up quite a bit of room and I want to make sure we have plenty of space to do it. So we are still going to use the quadratic formula, which is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so we're going to start plugging in. So we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus, now I'm going to go ahead and simplify this. 4 times 1 times 3 is 12. So I don't have to use quite as many steps to simplify that one since those numbers were smaller. That's all over 2. Okay, now we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root of, 4 minus 12 is negative 8. So automatically I can see, since this is a negative number, that means that I'm going to have no real solutions. So my discriminant, since this is a negative, that means that we're going to have no real solutions. That means we have 2 imaginary solutions. Okay, now we're going to talk about what to do with this. Okay, so I'm going to come up here and we're going to talk about what happens when you have a negative underneath the radical. So here's what's going to happen. We are going to continue with the simplifying process. So negative 2 plus or minus. Now at this point, when you have a negative under a radical, we are going to take an I, so you see where we have that negative 8? Anytime you have a negative under a square root, you're going to bring the I, which stands for imaginary, and bring it in front of the square root and then make that number positive. Okay, so at this step, all I did was take the negative out and make it an I. Okay, so we took the negative out and put I in front of the radical. Okay, now our next step, we are going to simplify the square root of 8. So we will talk about simplifying radicals more later on, but for now, we're just going to make it as simple as possible. So the square root of 8 can actually be broken down to 4 times 2, right? So 8 times 1 times 4 times 2. So those are the only two options for how to multiply to get 8. So we're going to break down 8 to be 4 times 2. Okay, so instead of 8 right here, I'm going to write 4 times 2 because that's the same thing as 8. And now what I have is the square root of 4 times 2. I know what the square root of 4 is, so I can bring that out in front of the radical. Okay, so again we have x equals negative 2 plus or minus. Since I know the square root of 4 is 2, so I'm going to bring 2 in front. I'm going to have 2i in front, and then square root of 2. And remember, we still have all of this over 2. Now what we can do, finally, this is going to be our last step, is to simplify. So finally, we are going to simplify all of the constants, or the coefficients, so all of the plain numbers, if possible. You can't always do that, but sometimes, most of the time, you will be able to. So what I mean by that is we have x equals, now I'm looking at negative 2 plus or minus 2i square root of 2. A lot of 2's here. But I'm going to look at the coefficients. Now coefficients, I'm going to do this in a different color. Okay, so coefficients are these numbers. Negative 2 over 2, and then this 2 over 2. So since those all can be simplified, negative 2 over 2 can be simplified to a whole number, 2 over 2 can be simplified to a whole number. Negative 2 over 2, which is just negative 1, plus or minus 2 over 2, which is 1i square root of 2. And believe it or not, those are our two answers. Negative 1 plus I square root 2 and negative 1 minus I square root 2 are our two solutions.